Good evening and welcome to our weekly Parsha class. This week is a special week. We know that every week the Torah portion is special, but when we have two Torah readings for which we take out two Torahs from the Ark, it gives you a double power of spirituality. That's true. Whenever there's a double parsha, there'll be a few more. There's a series of 4 before Purim and after Purim. But this one has a special significance because the additional reading is actually from last week's Torah portion of Kisisa, which talks about the donation of the Half-Shekel that they would have to give for the Mishkan, for the Tabernacle, and subsequently they would give it every year for the sacrifices. The lesson of the Half-Shekel, as we explained last week, was that every one of us has to recognize how we cannot be perfect without the other. That the Jewish people are one people and one Jew requires the other. That's one of the lessons. And we repeat this again this week. And the Torah portion that we read is Vayakhel, which means that he gathered. Moses gathered all the people, which again underscores the theme of gathering, of unity. So you have two different readings, and they both about the unity of the Jewish people. Vayakhel and the one about the Half-Shekel. So that reinforces the idea of unity even more so. So let's talk a little bit about this parsha. What you get from this parsha is that the Torah seems to not be very careful about the amount of space it allocates for one subject, which is contrary to what we know, that the Torah is very economical in its wording. Sometimes the Torah will say one word, and that one word is supposed to teach you so many different things. The Torah will leave out the details and would leave it to the oral tradition to fill in the gaps. But over here, it's a repetition of what we read 2 weeks ago and last week. This week's Torah portion and the week after is a repetition, albeit with a little bit of a variation, of all the details of the construction of the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the desert, known as the Mishkan, the Tabernacle in English. And the only difference is that in Parshas Truma 2 weeks ago, and last week Parshas Tetzaveh, it was God's communication to Moses, giving him the instructions about how to build the Mishkan, what should it include, what were the utensils, the vessels, the garments, the priestly garments. In this week's Torah portion, it's about Moses giving over the instructions to the people, and subsequently the people executing the orders that they got from Moses. So you have the commandment that God gives Moses to tell the people, you have Moses telling the people, and you have the people doing what Moses told them. And this is repeated over and over again. It could have just given us some details and then said, and Moses transmitted these details to the people, and the people carried out that which Moses told them to do. We would have saved dozens, if not hundreds of verses. And the Torah is so careful not to use too much language in every other case, and yet over here it seems to feel free to talk about all these details that seem to be unnecessary. What's even more interesting and problematic is that this subject here is not a practical one. There's nothing practical about how to build a Mishkan because we're not going to be building another one. The Mishkan was built in the desert. It was there for 39 years. It remained with them in the land of Israel that they conquered for the next 14 years. And then it was taken apart, and only part of it was used for the temple in Shiloh. That's where the temple resided for 369 years. They had solid walls, and the covering was the covering of the Mishkan, so they used part of the Mishkan. After that, the temple moved to 2 other places for a brief period, 57 years, and then the Holy Temple was built in Jerusalem, no more Mishkan. What happened to it? Well, the Talmud says that anything that Moses made would never be destroyed. So it was buried beneath the temple grounds, according to at least one opinion. And when Mashiach will come, we'll be able to have the Mishkan, so we'll be able to see it, to look at it, but we're not going to be building another Mishkan. We don't have to get or contribute all the items for the Mishkan, because we'll have everything already restored the way it was in the beginning. So why would the Torah spend so much time about every little minute detail of the Mishkan and repeat itself as well so many times? So in a past class we explained that we find a precedent for this when the Torah tells the story of Abraham sending his servant Eliezer to find a match for his son Yitzchak, for Abraham's son Yitzchak, Isaac. And Eliezer comes to the fountain, and he says, the first girl that will come and offer not only to give me water, but to give my camels, that's the right person. And that's exactly what happened. And the Torah tells us that in detail. And then when Eliezer speaks to Rivka's father and brother, he repeats the whole story again. Why did the Torah go into such detail? And Rashi quotes the Talmud that this is because it teaches us the love that God had for the patriarchs, that he spends more time discussing a story that involved one of the 8 patriarchs' servants, Eliezer, spending much more time and putting much more effort into explaining what happened, more so than the teachings that were given to the people, the children, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which sometimes you could have a whole subject contained within one verse or even one word. So what does that tell you? That when something is precious to you, when something elicits a feeling of love, you don't just say it quickly, you repeat it over and over and over again. No one's going to fault you because you repeated the words, I love you, more than once. Love generates the expression of love, that a person feels the need to express it and express it many times and many times over and not get tired. And the one who listens to it doesn't get tired either. When you're in love and you want to show how much you're in love, you do not limit what you're going to say. And that's the same thing is true. God loves the patriarchs, and that's why he shows how much time he's going to spend discussing things that relate to them. The same thing is true with the Mishkan. Let's give a little bit of the background. The Mishkan, according to most opinions, was built, the instructions were given over after the sin of the golden calf. What is the significance of that, of that chronology rather? The significance is that when God gave us the Torah, God says, I'm going to dwell among you. That's how God dwells among us, by giving us the Torah. When we sinned with the golden calf, God withdrew and restored the world to the pre-Sinai state in many ways. And it was not clear if God was going to dwell amongst us anymore. And when the Jewish people, when Moses pleaded for them, and they repented, and Moses comes back with the second tablets, that was a sign that God had forgiven them. And that happened on Yom Kippur. That's why it's the Day of Atonement, because that's when we were forgiven for the golden calf. But we still were not 100% sure that God was going to feel comfortable living with us. Yes, he's not going to punish us, but maybe he won't live with us anymore. So when God gives the instructions, speak to the people and tell them to build me a sanctuary and I will dwell in them, the people were relieved. This was the most exciting news that they can possibly get, that God is willing to dwell amongst them. So anything that had to do with the Mishkan, the instructions given to Moses, and Moses' instructions to the people, and the people executing the instructions, this was something that was so precious to them. There was so much love involved, and the love was on both sides, on God's side as well. But when God was telling them to build a Mishkan, and God allowed this to become part of the Torah, God was telling them, I love you. In spite of everything that happened in the past, my love for you has not diminished. And therefore, the Torah repeats itself over and over again. Now, Vayakhel means, and Moses gathered the entire Jewish community to give them these instructions. Why did he have to gather the entire Jewish community? Usually, when Moses had to speak to the people and give them instructions, Moses would teach it to Aaron, and he would teach it to Aaron's sons and to the elders, and they would go out and they would spread the message to everyone. Moses didn't have to gather all the people in order to give them instructions, but over here he gathered everyone. And the answer ties again with the significance of the Mishkan. The Mishkan was an atonement and a sign that God had forgiven the Jewish people for their involvement with the golden calf. The golden calf did not involve just a few individuals. Yes, they were the instigators, the Erev Rab, the multitude of nations that joined the people and were not sincere about their quote-unquote conversion to Judaism, and they brought back, when they had an opportunity, Moses was gone, to bring back idolatry that they were steeped in. Those were the main instigators. But then there were the people who listened to them and worshipped the golden calf. And then there were the people who didn't worship but didn't say anything or contributed to it. And then there were those who didn't contribute, but they nevertheless did not protest and did not do anything to stop it. So in a certain sense, the entire Jewish people was guilty in one form or another. And therefore, in order to atone for it by building the Mishkan, Moses felt it was important that everyone be gathered there to show that it's the power of the community that is being judged over here. God judged the entire Jewish nation. He said, let me destroy them, because everyone was guilty directly or indirectly. While there were different degrees of guilt, obviously, but everyone was implicated. And therefore, in the restoration of God's presence amongst the people, Moses felt this requires that everyone is involved. Everyone is united together for this effort. The theme of Vayakhel, and is the Half-Shekel, as I mentioned, is the theme of unity. Unity is one of the most precious ideals in Judaism. The Talmud concludes with the words, the Mishnah actually concludes with the words that God did not find a vessel that could contain blessing more than peace. In other words, God showers blessings on us, but we're not able to receive those blessings because the vessel that we have is cracked, or we don't have a vessel. Reminds me of a cute anecdote. I was once traveling from Las Vegas to Los Angeles by car, and I was told I have to be hydrated because of going through the desert. And I drank up the bottle of water that I bought, and I went to fill up with gas and to buy another bottle or two. And I noticed I paid about $2 for 8 ounces or something like that. I noticed there was a vending machine that said 1 gallon, 25 cents. I said, wow, what a bargain. And I put in my 25 cents, and out came a gallon of water, splattered all over the place. I didn't realize that you have to have a container for the water. And that's a perfect analogy, I realized, for life itself. God showers all sorts of blessings on us. If we have unity, which is very, very challenging sometimes, that is the vessel that will bring all the blessings of God. And that's why Moses feels that in order to be receptive to the blessing that God is going to shower on us after we have been rehabilitated from the golden calf, requires unity. Because if we don't have the unity, God's presence amongst us is a great blessing, but we won't be able to appreciate that blessing. When did this happen? When did Moses gather the people? So Rashi says it happened the day after Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, Moses comes down from the mountain with the second set of tablets. Jews are forgiven. And the next day, he gathers all the people and gives them the instructions concerning the Mishkan. In an earlier section, Rashi says that on the day after Yom Kippur, the very same day, Moses judged the people. This was written in a few weeks ago. We read this, how Moses was judging the people, and his father-in-law, Jethro, rebuked him for taking responsibility for all the people. He should have delegated authority, and Moses listened to him. When did that happen? That happened the day after Yom Kippur, the same day that he was given the instructions, or he was told to instruct the people about the Mishkan. Why were these two? Why did they mix these two different subjects? One is the building of the Mishkan, and the other one is judging people concerning their interpersonal feuds and conflicts. So commentators say something very, very basic, but it's an important lesson for all of us. Moses was concerned, I'm going to give instructions for people to contribute their gold, their silver, their copper, and all the other items that were necessary for the construction of the Mishkan, and the vessels and the garments and so on. But you know what? There are people who had fights about financial matters. They were feuding. Someone claimed that the other person took something from him, didn't pay him for what he sold him. Whatever it is, people get into arguments, and there's a possibility that one person is being wronged by the other. One is taking money that doesn't belong to him or her. And Moses was concerned that if that is not rectified, if the nation is going to be donating resources that are questionable if you really are the owner of them. You can't steal to give tzedakah. A person who robs someone and gives it to charity is not fulfilled a mitzvah. That's called mitzvah haba ba'avera, a mitzvah that comes through commission of a sin. It's not a mitzvah. As the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud puts it, ein avera mitzvah. A sin is not a mitzvah, and a mitzvah is not a sin. They're two distinct things. They're opposites. And Moses was concerned that people are going to be contributing with money, the ill-gained resources. Therefore, Moses devoted time the day after Yom Kippur first to straighten everything out, make sure that if anyone has any complaints against his fellow, that he has his money, he hasn't paid him, he owes him, or whatever it is, that should be worked out and reconciled. Only then did Moses say, okay, now you're ready to contribute to the Mishkan. And that's a very important lesson for us, that a person can think that he can get away with committing a crime against a fellow because he's using the opportunity to be a better servant of God, to build his own sanctuary. He can't build sanctuaries that way. Now, when you read the text at the very beginning of the Parsha, Moses gathered with all the people, and he says to them, these are the words that God commanded to do. And then he starts off with 6 days of the week you shall do work, where work shall be done, and the seventh day is a holy day. It's a day of rest. And it adds the penalty for violating the Shabbat. Then it says, don't light any fires in all your dwelling places on the day of the Shabbos. And then Moses speaks to them about contributing to the construction of the Mishkan. How does Shabbos come into the discussion over here? Moses had they already heard about Shabbos and the Ten Commandments. Why is Moses repeating about Shabbos? So one explanation is that Moses is telling them that, yes, I want you to build a Mishkan. It's very important. It's so important that your whole future relationship with God, it hinges on this construction, because this is the way God will dwell amongst you. But you think, well, if I have to build a Mishkan, I'll build it 7 days a week, however long it takes, including Shabbos. You would think it overrides the Shabbos. So the Torah says no. Before you build a Mishkan, you should know that you cannot work on Shabbos. And once you know that, then you can get the instructions for building the Mishkan. That's one explanation. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, the famous Hasidic master, in his commentary on the Torah, gives a deeper explanation. He says when Bezalel, the architect of the Mishkan, built the Mishkan, what was he doing in actuality? He wasn't just building a structure, because the Torah makes it sound like he was like filled with God's Spirit. What do you need God's Spirit to build? It's a rather fundamental structure. There was nothing really intricate about the structure, to the point that you need someone who's endowed with the Spirit of God. Anyone could have done it. Anyone with some brains and some artistic flair could have done it. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak explains, based on earlier sources, of course, that the same powers that were invested in creation of the universe, which God created through letters. Letters are forces. In Hebrew, the letters are not just letters, but they're also spiritual forces. That God put together these spiritual forces, creating a universe. The Mishkan was a mini-universe. And when God dwelled through the Mishkan, that was the way God also entered into the entire cosmos, that God was present in the entire universe through his presence in the Mishkan. So the whole idea of the Mishkan was to open ourselves up to the idea that God is the creator of the universe, and Bezalel was just exposed to God's plan and the way he built the universe and implemented that in the Mishkan. Well, that's exactly what Shabbos is all about. Why do we observe Shabbos? The primary reason is because it reminds us that God is the creator. Because there is a belief, a heretical belief, that there is no God. Of course, that's an atheistic belief. But the Greeks did believe in a God, but they also believed that God didn't create the universe, that the universe was always here and God was always here. They were parallel forces. And the whole Shabbat is to remind us that no, God created the world and he rested on the Shabbat. So the Mishkan is all about creation. The Mishkan is a model of the whole world, of the whole universe. And Shabbat is the reminder of creation. So the two themes go together hand in hand. Now, on Shabbat, we're supposed to desist from work. And Shabbat, we're passive. We don't work. Yet, when Moses introduces the Shabbat, he says, 6 days work shall be done, and on the seventh day is a holy day, means that it is a passive day. Right before that it says, Moses tells the people, these are the things that God commanded to do. To do is active, not passive. So, one explanation given in the Midrash, that he wasn't just referring to the negative commandments, the things you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. Yes, that's passive. It's talking about the positive things that we're supposed to do. And the Midrash gives an example of Shabbat should be a day when we gather to study Torah. There's an expression that Shabbat is an acronym for 3 words, Shina b'Shabbat ta'anug, which is mostly translated as sleeping on Shabbos is a pleasure. And Shabbos we're supposed to enjoy ourselves, so taking an afternoon nap, especially after you eat cholent, the stew that's on the fire all night long, you want to go to sleep, and going to sleep on Shabbat is a positive thing. But there are others who translate the word Shina differently. Shina could also come from a root that means to study. As it says in the Shema, V'shinantam levanecha, you shall teach them to your children. So Shina b'Shabbat ta'anug, when you study Torah on Shabbat, it's the greatest delight, the greatest pleasure. Anytime you study Torah, it's delightful. But especially when you study Torah on Shabbat. So that's the positive. And of course, there are other positives on Shabbat. We light Shabbat candles, although that's not biblical, it's rabbinical, but it's still a positive thing that we do on Shabbat. We say prayers on Shabbat, we make Kiddush on Shabbat, and so on. There are 39 categories of work we're not supposed to do on Shabbat. Yet the Torah only mentions one here. Don't light a fire on Shabbat. So there are different opinions why the Torah singles out this commandment. But there's also a lesson from this commandment about something we're supposed to do, practical, actively, for Shabbat. The Sadducees, and later on the Karaites, denied the oral Torah. They took the written Torah literally. Now, when you take it literally, sometimes you come up with really very far-fetched ideas. So they took this verse literally. When it said you shall not kindle a fire in any of your dwelling places, they translated this as you should not have any fires in your dwelling places. Well, if you don't have fire and you're living in a cold climate like Buffalo, New York, in the winter, you're going to freeze. No fire, no heat. You're going to eat cold food. So you're going to freeze, you're going to eat cold food, and you will have no light. So Friday night is going to be pitch dark, eating cold food in the freezing temperatures of the winter. But if they believed that that's what the Torah was saying, I'm sure not all of them did it, but many of them did do it. But we repudiate that very strongly. In fact, in the Talmud we find that anything that we do that was different from the Sadducees, we didn't just do it quietly, we made a big to-do about it. We made a lot of fanfare. For example, when there was a dispute, when you cut the grain, the barley, for the Omer offering on Pesach, The tradition that we follow is to do it the second day of Passover. The Sadducee says it should be done on a Sunday, always on a Sunday. So when they would cut the barley and it wasn't done Sunday, they would make a big to-do about it. Same thing with the holiday of Sukkot, when they would pour water on the altar. Now, that's not mentioned in the Torah. This is based strictly on an oral tradition. The Sadducees didn't believe in that. So when they would draw the water for pouring on the altar, they would make a big celebration. It was the most incredible celebration that they had in the temple. So the same thing is true with the commandment not to have a fire in your house. We know it means don't kindle a fire. But if the fire is already there, it's permissible to have. And that's one of the reasons why we light Shabbat candles before the onset of Shabbat. Now, to be sure, there are three other reasons that are more fundamental. The three reasons are, number one, it's to enjoy the Shabbat. With more light, you enjoy the meal. Number two is to give honor to the Shabbat. And number three is to prevent stumbling and bumping into each other, disrupting the peace in the home. It's to contribute a state of tranquility and peace. But this is a fourth reason. It's to repudiate the Sadducees who don't believe in the oral Torah. We're saying, yes, we believe in the oral Torah, and you're allowed to have fire on Shabbat, and you should have fire, and you should eat hot food, and you should be warm, and you should have light in your house. So the Torah, by telling you not to light fire, is really giving you the idea of lighting Shabbat candles, something not just passive, but something active for the Shabbat. When the Torah describes the different vessels, let's say it says the ark, it doesn't say what the ark was for. We know what it was for. It's for the tablets. When it talks about the shulchan, the table, it doesn't say what the table was for. We know already it was to put the bread on it. But when it talks about the menorah, it tells you what the menorah was for. The menorah was for light, for illuminating. Why does the Torah have to tell us that? We already know that the menorah, what is a menorah? A candelabrum. What is it for? It's for light. You light the flames and that gives off light. Why did the Torah have to add that qualifier, that it's the menorah for light, as if you should think it's there for light but not for anything else? So one way of explaining that is that the menorah, the way it was designed, it was full of ornaments. It was made out of one piece of gold. It had decorations like apples, like goblets. And it was a very beautiful piece of art. It was so beautiful and so intricate that Moses didn't know how to make it, and they just was told to take the gold and throw it into the fire, and miraculously out came the menorah. So the menorah was a very, very exquisite piece of divine artistry. So one would have thought that menorah was not there for light. The menorah was there for people to come to a museum to see something beautiful, to see divine beauty. So the Torah says, no, that's not what it was for. Yes, it's a beautiful piece. It has artistic value. If we had the menorah now, it would be the greatest attraction in the world. But that's not what it was for. The purpose of the menorah was to bring light to the world. The windows in the Beit HaMikdash, the Mishkan didn't have windows, and the Beit HaMikdash were designed in such a way that the light would go out. There was no need for light inside the Mishkan. The light would go out. And the Talmud says that the menorah was proof that God dwelled among Israel, because the western candle, Ner HaMaravi, the western candle, would never extinguish. If they wouldn't extinguish it to rekindle it, it would not extinguish on its own. It always had the Hanukkah miracle there perpetually during the first temple and a little bit of the second temple. So the purpose of the menorah was to bring the light, the divine light, to illuminate the whole world. And therefore, we have a very powerful lesson that the menorah, with all of its intricacies and all of its beauty, we have to spread the beauty of the menorah, the light of the menorah, which is the light of Torah, to the whole world. Judaism is not a bland religion. Judaism is a beautiful religion. Rabbi Elimelech of Lezentz, because the Yartzeit we just observed a few days ago, the 21st of Adar, Rabbi Elimelech of Lezentz says that the Ner HaMaravi, the Western Ner, the one that gave light all the time, but never ceased giving off light, the word Maravi has two other translations. It comes from a word which means multiple use, and it comes from a word which means sweet. The light was beautiful, different colors, and it was also sweet. And what is the message? The lesson is that Torah is not bland. It's multifaceted and sweet. Torah combines intellectual, emotional, practical, rational, mystical, warm, and inviting, while it also is firm and demanding. And the light of the menorah should reflect all these different shades. And we must become non-extinguishable Western lights. That means we have to reflect the entire spectrum of Torah use. And one more condition, the light that we spread, in addition to being sweet light, we have to do it in a sweet way. We have to teach Torah in a way that is sweet, because Torah itself is very sweet. One final discussion. When the Torah mentions Bezalel, the architect, it tells us that Bezalel was the son of Uri, who was the son of Hur. That's unusual. His assistant, his deputy, was a man by the name of Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach. Doesn't mention his grandfather, Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach. So why, when it comes to Bezalel, it tells you his father, Uri, that's fine. Usually the Torah will tell you a name of a person. To identify the person, it'll tell you his name and his father's name. But then it adds Ben Hur, the son of Hur. Why is that important to know his grandfather? So it seems that Rashi anticipated that question, and Rashi adds the words, who was this Hur? The son of Miriam. Miriam was Moses' older sister, and she had a son, and his name was Hur. What is Rashi trying to tell us? I think Rashi's trying to tell us the reason why the Torah identifies Bezalel by his grandfather is to tell you that Bezalel inherited the special quality of Hur, and Hur himself personified the ideals of his mother Miriam. And his mother Miriam was very, very special. And that's why the Torah tells us that Bezalel was unique. It's not just because of his own wisdom, but it's because he inherited the divine inspiration from Hur, who was a child of and represented the ideals of his mother Miriam. Now we find Hur mentioned in the Torah three different places. One is when the Jews left Egypt, they were attacked by Amalek. Moses went up on the mountain. He raised his hands upward, and whenever he raised his hands, the Jews were victorious in their battles. If his hands faltered, they would start losing. So what happened? Aaron, Moses' brother, would raise one hand, one arm, and Hur would raise the other. So Hur was there to support Moses' arms in his prayers. Well, second time we find Hur, when Moses is ready to go up to the mountain, Mount Sinai, to get the Torah, he says to the people, Aaron and Hur will be in your place to judge you if you ever need to be judged. And what happened then was they built a golden calf. Hur protested it, and he was murdered. He gave his life to prevent this terrible desecration of God. And the third time he's mentioned is the construction of the Mishkan. And in all these three places, Rashi adds he was the son of Miriam. In other words, there's a quality that Miriam had that was inherited by Hur. And what are these three qualities? These are the three qualities that women distinguish themselves over men. What are the three qualities? Well, one of them is prayer. How do we know the laws of prayer? Many of the laws are derived from the story of Hannah. Hannah, the prophetess, who prayed to God for a child, and she gave birth to Shmuel, the prophet who anointed King Shaul and then King David. And he started the whole Davidic dynasty that will lead to Mashiach. So Hannah prayed in the temple in Shiloh, and the high priest Eli thought she was drunk because she was davening with such fervor and she was silent. He couldn't imagine why she was davening that way. And she said, no, I'm not drunk. I'm just a very stubborn woman. In other words, persistent prayer is a feature that is feminine. Men will say their prayers. Of course, there are men who learn the lessons from the women, but the women are the model for that. The Talmud says we learned all these laws about prayer from Chana, from a woman. And women are persistent in their prayers. They don't give up. They don't just take no for an answer. And if there's no answer, they keep on praying with all their might. And that's what Hur did. Hur was the one who supported Moses in his prayer. And you can imagine how difficult it is to just hold someone's arm up in the air. It was hard for Moses, but it was also hard for the one who kept his hand aloft. So Hur represents the highest level of prayer, the support for prayer at the highest of level. Then we find Hur in the context of protecting the faith by protesting and resisting the building of the golden calf. Again, women have always shown greater measures of faith than men. And there are many stories that show this, that illustrate this. When men were ready to give up in Egypt, the women kept going. Miriam rebuked her father, who separated from his wife because he didn't want to bring more children into the world. So Miriam rebuked him, and he listened to her. So the women were imbued with greater faith. When the Jews cried, when they heard the report of the spies that Israel is unconquerable, the women did not cry. They didn't lose their faith in God, who promised that this is a great land, the land of milk and honey. And then the third thing about women, and this is in the context of building of the Mishkan, that women, we're all here to create small miniature sanctuaries. The Mishkan was the model that we have to follow, not in terms of the way it's constructed, but the concept of creating a home that's a dwelling place for God. That's why the home is the ideal place for most of Judaism. That's where we keep kosher. That's where we keep the Shabbat. That's where we observe the holidays. That's where we educate our children, and so on and so forth. That's where we have mezuzahs on the doorposts. The home is the ultimate sanctuary for a Jew. And who creates the home? Who takes the house and turns it into a home? Who brings in the light into the home by lighting Shabbat candles? Who is there to make sure that the food is kosher and brings holiness in the home? Who is there to bring purity in the laws of family purity and mikveh? It's the woman primarily. And that's why Hur is mentioned the third time. He's mentioned in the context of building the Mishkan. And he's mentioned as the son of Miriam, because it's Miriam's influence that gave him the power to create that sanctuary.